Okay, so my father was a Navy pilot for over 28 years, and he started his combat tours in the Solomon Island campaign after the Battle of Guadalcanal. And he had a second tour of duty in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, but when back in the early 1990s, when the 50th anniversary of World War II was coming along, and the Battle of Guadalcanal sort of what do you call it? 50th anniversary, I guess, was about to take place. I had this thought that, like, maybe it'd be cool to go back to the Solomons with my father, because I grew up I'm an only child, and I grew up in our nuclear family with my father always telling these stories about the South Pacific, and he made it sound like it was this kind of James Michener experience, like the musical. And in fact, he flew the same kind of planes that were featured in the musical, these PBY amphibious Black Cat night bombers, and his stories were always so amazing, because he talked about the adventure and the danger and the camaraderie with his fellow pilots, and especially camaraderie around this O Club at a forward base in the Solomons called Ondonga. And he also talked about misery. He talked about a whole crew of 10 men lost from his squadron one night over a Japanese-held island of Choiseul. And he talked about fear. And he was assigned to basically do a suicide mission. It was a one plane, sort of midnight, bad weather attack on Rabaul Harbor. So I'd always heard these stories, and it just made my father seem larger than life. And truth be told, my father's health wasn't very good then. He was in his mid to late 70s. He was a 2-pack-a-day smoker. So he had cardiac issues as a consequence of the smoking, and I just felt like I shouldn't miss any opportunities to have an adventure with my father. So I basically asked him if he would like to go back to this place, where there was a legendary spot for him. And so we said, yeah, let's try to do it. And as a consequence, because I was a journalist, I enlisted the support of people like Smithsonian Magazine and major newspapers like the Washington Post and the Denver Post, and God only knows, like Miami Herald, St. Petersburg Times, Boston Globe. They all said, yeah, why don't you do it? So the plan was that my father and my mother and I would retrace his route to the South Pacific with his Patrol Squadron 12, VP 12. My parents were married right before he left in San Diego, and then he flew off in his Transpac. And so I met my mom and dad in San Diego, and we stayed on base at North Island Naval Air Station. And then the next day we caught an Air New Zealand flight out of LAX for Honolulu, because that was the first leg of the flight that my father had flown. Because we were doing this, this is as a piece of journalism and not just a sentimental journey, we had cockpit access, and so Air New Zealand, my father and I basically rode in the jump seats of this, I don't know, it was probably 767, on the whole flight out to Oahu. And as soon as the plane was at altitude, the pilot, the aircraft was on autopilot, and the co-pilot got out of his seat and he said, "Well, Chester, that's my dad." He said, "Why don't you sit down here?" Because my father, in that first tour, he'd been a co-pilot on PBY, so that's the right seat. So now he got down on the right seat of this jumbo jet, and he sat and he basically told stories the whole way out. Talked about, like, you know, it was a 19-hour plus flight in a PBY because they were so slow from San Diego to Oahu. And he talked about how they were so, it was such an extended flight that they were like right on the edge of the capability of the aircraft, and that how they were like running out of fuel as they approached Oahu, and they actually lost, no, they didn't lose power, but they had to lighten the airplane, so they'd like throw all their gear and all the armament off the airplane just to keep it flying. And like the airplane was not capable of climbing anymore, and so they just kept getting lower and lower and lower. And by the time they got to Kaneohe, like there's no chance they could have got to the other side of the island to Pearl, I guess. And by the time they got to Kaneohe, that they were, I mean, they're really coming in and winging a prayer at like 150 feet, you know, and then they just, thank God it was an amphibian, right? And they just landed on the water at the seaplane base at Kaneohe Marine Air Station. So that was the first part of the trip, and he told those stories, and the Air New Zealand crew was kind of like, wow, you know, because they didn't have autopilots, they had to hand fly the airplane the whole way. At any rate, so when we got to Oahu, we stayed in Navy housing in Honolulu, but then we went over to Kaneohe Naval Air Station as we walked around, because my father was a career pilot. His Navy ID got us on base, and there were all these Marine attack squadrons there flying F-18s, and these guys are just back from the first Iraqi War, and from flying night attacks on Baghdad. But when they met my father and he told them, you know, why he was there, they brought us into the squadron ready room, and again, they just sat my dad down and they wanted to talk like what aerial combat was like, what it was like being a naval aviator back in the 1940s, because for them, even though these guys are fresh from combat and all that madness of the night attacks on Baghdad, they said it was rather, you know, they didn't feel like they were in much danger, and that everything was very automated, you know, like the attacks are all computerized, and your attack plans are all generated by an AWACS aircraft, et cetera, et cetera. And they wanted to know, you know, like what it was like in the old days. So my dad, Dad full of stories. Chester was a hero. We left Air New Zealand again and flew to Fiji. Same kind of game, cockpit access, my dad telling stories the whole way out. And he seemed kind of like blithe and cavalier and lighthearted. But when we left Fiji on an Air Solomon's flight to Honiara on Guadalcanal, Henderson Field, I could see my dad kind of getting anxious. Just got this kind of like vacant look in his face, and his complexion got sallow, and so I knew that something was up, and it was clear to me that he was going to have to face off with some old ghosts. He told me stories of misery out there, about bombs that he had dropped, and certain bombing raids that had gone astray, and he knew that he'd killed civilians and things, and that he wasn't happy that he lived with that. And then, of course, he wasn't happy that he lost a lot of, like Crew 3 out there. And, of course, my father was, you know, he's 77, and he was feeling very mortal. I mean, he'd gone to a fair number of squadron reunions, and every year there'd be fewer and fewer people showing up. And he knew his generation was dying off. But at any rate, there was a certain anxiety there. On the flight out, again, cockpit access, and we're in this Air Solomon 737, and the flight crew was, they were Australians, and as they heard about my father and his stories, they said, "Hey, Chester, you know what? Why don't you take the co-pilot seat?" And he was telling the stories. But as we got closer to Guadalcanal, my dad looked out and he said, "I know where I am." He hadn't been there for 50 years. But he goes like, "I know exactly." And he started to talk through what the approach procedure would be, as you're flying into Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. And the pilots are about ready to, you know, they're making their descent. The aircraft was still on autopilot, and they're going, "We're going to switch off the autopilot, Chester. You want to shoot the approach?" And he went, "Well, give me the numbers." And he gets into the chair, and he starts doing his pilot thing, and we've been there telling stories, and he goes like, puts his hands on the controls, and it's like, "Give me the numbers," which means like altitude, airspeed, and so they're talking it through, and he just flew this plane like it was a piece of cake. And he was basically saying, "This is a lot easier than flying a PBY or a PB4Y2 because you know, a jet is so much smoother in the air, and the controls are dampened, and like they had, like in a PBY, it was like direct control, so it was like, you know, like you had to horse the aircraft around, and here, you know, like a 737, it's like you're flying a Cessna, you know." But at any rate, he shoots the approach, and he's like, "We're coming in," and he goes, "It's the same, like the tower, like the shipwrecks as you approach the airport were the same. That were left over from like the Battle of Guadalcanal, and the tower, the military tower on the field was the same." So it was like this weird. I mean, it was obviously this eerie thing for my father, like a deja vu. And he flies the airplane loaded with passengers down to a couple hundred feet, and then he looks at the pilot and he goes like, "Your aircraft." We land and we get off, and again, like my father, all that enthusiasm, all that vitality that he had flying in there disappeared again. And it was hot, muggy. It's the tropics. It's March, and he starts to withdraw again until our next flight, which was to take us out into the islands where to look for Ondonga, his lost base. This legendary spot, right? So we catch a flight. It was an Air, I forget what they were called. Maybe it was Air Solomon's again. But they flew these Twin Otter 19-passenger commuter planes, the high wing. And it's interesting because of the configuration of the airplane. It was a lot like a PBY, like my father flew, because PBY was high wing, twin engine. And the cockpit setup was the same because your throttles and your prop and your mixture controls are all on the ceiling. Most aircraft, they're down here, but on a PBY they're up here, so you're flying with one hand and you're controlling your throttles and your props and your mixture up here. So it was a very similar thing for my father. Well, the Twin Otters only have one pilot, so my dad of course sat in the co-pilot seat, and we told the pilot that we were going to have this pilot for 2 weeks because we're basically following his route through the Solomons as he did these commuter flights. And so we told him we were looking for Ondonga, and where it was near Munda, because Munda was where we were going that night. And so when we get out, we see this old, like, big bomber strip at Munda where we're about to land, but to shoot the approach, made this big wide right-hand turn because Ondonga was only 10 miles from there. So when we sweep out over there, like my father's got these aviation strip charts that were left over from 1943, and so we're looking at the landscape, and everything's registering. My dad's like going, I know this, I know. And then he goes like, Ondonga should be right over there, and we're circling around it, but there's like nothing. It's just forest.